What up, y'all? Mesquite season. Let me show you how I do it. So it's actually been a really terrible year for mesquite beans, but you can still find them. It's okay because normally mesquites are really easy to gather. You can get an insane amount, so even a poor year you can still find a good amount. The main problem this year is you see all these little dots on the mesquite bean. All of that is feeding damage from sap feeding bugs. They look like stink bugs, but they're leaf-footed bugs, family Coridae. But they just pierce the skin with their mouth parts, sort of suck it out like a syringe or a straw, going for the juice. And I think you see so much of that on the mesquite beans this season because there's fewer mesquite beans, and so the feeding rate, the damage rate is going to be higher for the ones that are, because there's the same number of those bugs. Because those bugs feed on a lot of stuff, actually. They feed on cactus and a lot of different plant stuff, just basically whatever is sweet and in season. And mesquite's in season. So you can just chew them up in a field, but you don't really eat the beans. So technically you can't eat the beans, but I'll get into that later. For the most part, what you're going after for mesquite is the mesocarp. So in the layers of mesquite, you have the very thin outer skin, the mesocarp, which is like a spongy, fleshy layer that's sweet. That's what you want to go for the most part. And on the very inside, you have your mesquite beans. They're kind of like this trapezoid shape. Now, historically, various tribes have eaten the beans, but it wasn't very common. They kind of aren't really, they're tough to grind up. There are special ways to getting into the little endosperm inside, basically the equivalent to, what do you call it? Anyway, a little kernel of edible stuff in there, but then you have to pound it open. This one's still green, so you can't really tell, but they're a pain to really get to. So for the most part, all the carbohydrates and the nutrition is going to be obtained from the mesocarp. And historically, get some gathering here instead of just talking. That's why I have this chest rig, and I have also my butterfly net, or it's a sweep net. I actually got it for grasshoppers, cooked grasshoppers, but I brought it out to the field because it's very convenient for pulling down mesquite branches. Let's see, where's one with some fruits? And this was a historical method of pulling. Obviously, just pull it down. But using a hook stick was a historical method used by various tribes. And, they can be gathered green. Right now, I can still find some that are green. Most of them are mature. So you know when they're mature if you shake it and there's a little rattle. It's all dried up. You snap it. It's a crisp snap. The green ones are green, and they don't really snap cleanly. But these tend to be a little bit more bitter. They will dry out if you just let them sit on the shelf for a little while, and then they're easier to process. But the green ones are easier to chew in the field. That's what I do with them. Either chew them up in the field or let them dry. Now, one thing I want to put up front is a lot of people will dissuade others from picking up mesquite beans from the ground. They'll tell you, don't do that. And a lot of times they don't even have a reason for that. But I'll tell you the reason for that. It's a recommend. I don't know really where it became popularized, but the origin of it is from a study of mesquite beans in Arizona, and they looked at the aflatoxin concentration of mesquite beans found on the ground after the monsoon rains in Arizona. So, aflatoxin is a carcinogenic toxin produced by fungi, and fungi grow in the presence of moisture. And monsoon rains are like they sound, a lot of rain, all of a sudden very hot climate, have a carbohydrate-rich medium, so it's perfect for bacterial growth or fungal growth. So I wouldn't recommend gathering mesquite pods from the ground if you live in a hot area. Well, I mean, you obviously do live in a hot area if you have mesquite. But if there's been some recent heavy rains, or really any rains at all, if you want to be safe, it hasn't really rained here in a while. Another thing to be aware of is rodents will chew on mesquite beans on the ground, and you can contract an incurable disease from rodent saliva called hantavirus. It actually kind of tore through the Navajo Nation maybe 100 years ago or 80 years ago. I don't know the initial origin of it. Could have been from mesquite beans, but you can usually see when a mesquite bean's been chewed up by some rodent, so probably don't grab those or along a main trail like right here. But viruses tend to die with sun exposure. It's been exposed to the sun and not in contact with rodents for a while is probably safe, but I don't recommend doing anything that I do. Everything's a risk, people. So yeah, normally these trees are just loaded with mesquite beans. Slim pickings this year. But how do you eat mesquite beans? I mentioned chewing up the green ones in the field. A nice sweet taste, a little bit more bitter if they're green, but the trees do vary significantly in their taste, like any wild food. There's going to be a lot of variation in palatability. So you can sample around if you have an abundance and just choose the best trees. But what did I say? Oh, the mature pods are sweeter. And so there's many methods historically among different indigenous groups in North America for processing mesquite as there are those groups, so there's many more methods than there are tribes. But you can kind of categorize them into two main methods. The hackberries are coming along nicely. These are very delicious to eat, nice and sweet, with thin, pulpy outer flesh and a big, crunchy seed that's also very nutritious. The two main methods of processing can be categorized into a drink method or a meal method. So in the drink method, you're crushing the pods, pounding them up, and then adding water and straining. And so there's a lot of different ways you can do that in form, but in the end, that's the core method. And sometimes they were even made into a pulp, and the pulp itself was eaten rather than more of the infusion. But most commonly, it was just a simple cold water extraction. Occasionally they're boiled. I know the Comanche boiled them, but boiling or cooking them at all is kind of unusual among the different accounts of tribes that I have, which I have, over 30 different accounts of individual tribes' uses of mesquite. It is by far the most used plant in all of the Southwest in all of my research, and the most important food plant for the most number of tribes. So yeah, like 30 or so tribes considered it a highly valuable food source, and probably everyone who lived in the range of mesquite was eating mesquite beans. So you have the drink method, and I do that conveniently in modern times with a blender. I find the very easiest way is to throw the ripe mesquite pods in a blender, add water to the top, frappe, or just whatever setting, and then strain it with just a sort of coarse coarse mesh wire sieve. And it produces a sweet drink that has some, the flavor's a little bit like tamarind. So, I don't know how you describe that, maybe a little tangy, but sweet. It also has some notes of caramel and a slight bit of bitterness, but the trick I've learned to cut that bitterness is to add a bit of salt. And I was inspired to do that by Cabeza de Vaca's account of mesquite beans being eaten by Texas natives in 1530, the earliest written account of any mesquite beans being eaten, which he doesn't call them mesquite or anything even, but I just deduced it very clearly from the other evidence he gave. But they would throw them all in a big earth mortar. So mortar and pestle were most commonly used to grind the mesquite beans in preparation for making a drink or the meal. And you need a huge one. I made one out of willow wood last summer. It's still not quite as big as many historical ones, but big enough to pound them up. And you got a long pestle, 4 feet long, 5 feet long or so. But these Texas natives, whoever they were, they could have been the Lipan Apache, but they use just a mortar dug out in the earth. But in addition to pounding them up in the earth, to the pounded meal, they would add clay. It might have been some specific type of clay, probably was, and perhaps one that's higher in salt concentration. But the reason Cabeza de Vaca gave for the addition of earth was to cut the bitterness. So those compounds are binding on to the plant compounds that produce the bitter taste. So a little bit of salt replicates that nicely, and I will just pour that strained mesquite meal I blended up into a glass of ice and add a pinch of salt. And it also really goes well with flavors like cinnamon, chocolate, caramel, of course, and even coffee. So you can make some cool, nice drinks that way. And as I said, historically, you pound it up in the mortar and pestle and just add water. And often in different households, you just have a big clay basin that was just kept full of mesquite beans, and water was added as needed to produce that drink. So the other method would be the dry method and the meal method, where again you're pounding up the mesquite, but this time you want to end up with it being very fine meal, or as fine as possible, and you're gonna have to remove the seeds and the thin skin. So once you've removed the seeds and the skin and the fibers, essentially, they have some long stringy fibers, you take that dry meal. Well, you can do a lot of stuff with it, but the most common method was to store it long term. That's the best way to store it. So you lay out the powder in a little layer, and then you sprinkle some water over it, and the water binds and makes it harden up. And then you sprinkle another layer of the meal, sprinkle a little bit more water, and that binds up, and then you just build up a cake that's like a nice big brick, and then that dries, and you can kind of store that indefinitely, and it's a very nutritious meal. Those mesquite meal cakes were used for trade and barter. So I found with modern methods, it's a little painstaking to turn it into a meal. Okay, here are some better trees here. Some ripe ones. Yeah, another way that I often will gather them is by just shaking the tree. They're not really releasing. But a lot of times you can shake it and a bunch will fall down. A few fall down. So the sap of mesquite was also commonly made into a drink simply by adding water. The sap is perfectly edible and produces a kind of sweetish, nice drink. The sap is also very commonly historically used for a lot of other purposes, or at least a handful of pretty prominent ones. Both the sap and the leaves were, by a number of different tribes, used for an eye wash, for, in the case of inflamed eyes. And the leaves, you would make an infusion out of the dried powdered leaves. And the sap, you would just dissolve it in water and use that as eye drops. But one interesting use of the sap was for removing lice and dyeing the hair at the same time. So the sap would be mixed with clay and applied to the hair and allowed to set and dry overnight. And then the next day it was washed out and the hair would be left nice and dyed black and silky, so like a conditioner. The sap turns black in contact with air, oxidation. Sap is also used as an adhesive, kind of like pine pitch. And the wood is very strong, very hard. People hate mesquite. Well, I'll go into that later, but it's got some very useful wood. It's used for all sorts of tools and implements, like gardening tools, hoes, and mauls, and axe handles, and it's even used for bows by the Cahuilla and Yuma and Camilla. But those are all desert-dwelling peoples, and not a lot of trees in the desert. Mesquite, willow, cottonwood, those are your main choices. I did make a mesquite bow myself pretty recently this summer, but I broke it. It's not super elastic, it's not the best material for bows. It worked. I was able to improve its functionality, but it's a little stiff. And what happened is I was stringing the bow for actually a final demonstration video, but I tried to string it by stepping on the end, which is how I do my just fiberglass bows I've been shooting forever. It's not the most professional way of stringing a bow, but I was just kind of going on autopilot and did that with this little mesquite bow and cracked the tip. But it can be used for that. One challenge, though, is finding a straight enough section of mesquite wood. It's a very curvy plant. And it's full of thorns, and it's super hard wood, so it's a pain to actually get into the shape of a bow, especially if you're doing stone tools, which I was doing. Did a mulberry bow, just like way better wood and way easier to carve. Let's see if we can shake some down. Oop, one hit my head. Not many willing to go right now. So, see these little holes? Those are exit holes for bruchid beetles. These little beetles that they actually live inside the seeds of the beans. The eggs get laid and then they develop within the seeds, and burrow out, leaving those little exit holes. So if you see holes actually sign that beetles gone. If there's no holes, that doesn't mean there's no beetles. But guess what? Brooked beetles are perfectly edible. Why not add some extra fat and protein? I never care or regard the beetles at all. If they have holes in them, I don't care. If they don't, I don't care. If I know they're in there, I also don't care. But they can be a problem in storage. So I had a big store of mesquite beans because I was trying to see the best way to store them for just myself. And historically, they were stored by all the native groups that relied upon them, usually in like basketry granaries. But of note, the basketry granaries often were made of or incorporated highly insect repellent plants such as wormwood or an Artemisia species. And the reason for that is probably to deter infestation, but also to prevent reinfestation from within. Because I put a bunch of mesquite beans in a plastic storage bin, which is a cheap thing I had around. It's waterproof, and so I can set it outside. It was actually working pretty great for a while, but I would open it up and I would see a ton of those beetles waiting to get out. But at some point we had some unseasonal rains in the summer, and I guess water got in there, and well, now they're all just a big mycorrhizal mat, which a fungus infected them, and I had to throw them out. Don't want the aflatoxin, or just to eat fungus. But usually about a 2-year store was made, or at least a year, because you might go, you need enough for the year that you're in, and then for one more, because you can always have a bad year. And often wild plants do work on schedules like that, where 1 year just none of the plants really produce that well, so their fruit or nuts, and then the next year they'll do real well, and it'll keep going in that cycle. So 2-year store is the safest. But the flowers in mesquite were also eaten. They're like these long dangling little yellowish flowers, but I tried a bunch and they're just all kind of bitter to me. I don't really see the point. The word made into tea, so maybe it's more palatable that way. I mean, I've tried that way, but yeah, I'm not sure much of the point for that. Okay, so one last thing. People hate mesquite, but mesquite is good, actually. Mesquite's the only plant that's classified by the USDA as invasive and is also a native species. So mesquite is unequivocally native to the southwest U.S. Historical, botanical, paleobotanical records have shown the presence of mesquite thousands of years. But it has been introduced in other parts of the world, namely around Saharan Africa, to prevent desertification. Because when all the plants in a particular area die off, then it's going to form a desert because you have nothing to hold onto the soil. It's all going to blow away. But it kind of became invasive and a problem because of a number of factors. So it has the deepest taproot of any tree in the world. They do really well where other plants do not, because they have an extremely long taproot, the longest known taproot of any species in the world. It can go as deep as 200 feet. So these aren't going that deep, but they're able to reach water where other plants can't, especially in arid regions. So it's also a factor behind why it is an important plant food, because in the desert it's able to reach water still and produce these fruits for us. Its roots also harbor bacterial symbionts, root nodules that affix atmospheric nitrogen. Nitrogen is a prime component of protein, so they're able to produce a lot of high protein foliage and fruits. That's why the deer in South Texas are such monsters, because there's a lot of leguminaceous species upon which they feed down there, like the various acacias and Senegalia and mesquite. And mesquite also produces so many seeds, so it's building up a seed bank in the soil. So cut a bunch down, they're going to easily spring back from that seed bank. So what has happened in the Southwest is that after colonization, a bunch of settlers cleared the land to make way for their cattle. They probably just envisioned a perfect little idyllic countryside grassland, but it just doesn't work that way. And it cleared away a diversity of different plants, but mesquite was the best at springing back. It formed dense thickets, with very hard wood. It's also super thorny, and it's a huge pain to deal with and clear out if you're a rancher. But is that really an intrinsic property of the plant, or is it just a survivor? Because that's a product of human intervention. I don't know how that justifies classifying it as invasive, but it is the U.S. Department of Agriculture, so not too surprising there. But those thorns were used as well for other purposes. A great little piercing tool. We used them for tattoo needles, and I would use the green leaves as tattoo ink. But it also uses awls, fabric pins. Man, I'm really in this thicket, huh? Cut it all down. It's taking over, it's invading. It's all around me. It's poking me, it's evil. That's how y'all sound sometimes. Okay, but it really is. Well, that's probably about all I got to say about mesquite at the moment. Sorry, I can go on forever. One interesting fun factoid is that there's no native animal that actually disperses mesquite. So the animals that disperse mesquite nowadays are cattle, ironically enough. And it's hypothesized that historically they produce so many large bean pods and have such strong, resilient wood because their historical dispersers were megafauna, such as gomphotheres, giant ground sloths, so these giant elephant-like animals, which are not around anymore. So we would call this an anachronism. But it makes sense to me. It's a hypothesis. I'm not sure if any gomphotheres or giant sloths have been found with mesquites in their guts, but I mean, to even find anything in any fossil's guts is profoundly rare. But I believe it. Anyway, that's all I have to say about mesquite. I hope you enjoyed it.